friends, I'm Lindsay from All the Nourishing Things, and in this video I'm going to talk about my 3 favorite ways to freeze bone broth. Hi there, welcome back to my kitchen. I'm Lindsay from All the Nourishing Things, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about my 3 favorite ways to freeze bone broth. Now, I always have a good supply of bone broth on hand. I use it almost daily for making soups and stews. I like to cook our rice, beans, and quinoa in it. Sometimes I like to just warm up a bit and drink it straight out of a mug, or I might be doing a bone broth fast, and in which case I would need to have a lot of bone broth on hand. So I don't want to keep it in the refrigerator all the time because it doesn't last as long. Although I have friends who can their bone broth, I unfortunately do not know how to can, nor do I have the equipment to can. So for me, the easiest way to make a bunch of broth and have it on hand at all times is to freeze it. So here are my 3 favorite ways to freeze bone broth with the pros and cons of each way. Okay, so the first way that you can freeze bone broth is in glass jars. And here I have some bone broth frozen in a quart-sized mason jar. The advantages to freezing broth in glass jars are the food never touches plastic, the jars are reusable, so you have less waste, and the metal gasket with the ring creates an airtight seal which can help keep your broth from freezer burn, and it will keep it fresher longer. However, there are some disadvantages to freezing your broth in jars, and the first one, which is the main one, is that the jars frequently crack even when you leave plenty of headspace. And as you can see, this jar has a big crack in it. And I have left, as you can tell, plenty of headspace. The top of the jar is up here, the broth comes to here, and the jar still cracked on me. This happens to me more often than not, so freezing broth in jars is not my favorite way to freeze my broth. When the jars crack, this creates waste. Obviously, this jar is no longer usable and I'll have to throw it out. Another disadvantage to freezing broth in jars is that you can't use the broth until it's completely thawed. If this jar wasn't cracked, there's no way that I could get any broth out of this jar until it was totally thawed. The next disadvantage is that freezing broth in jars ties up the jar so you can't use them for something else. And I like to have a lot of quart-sized jars on hand because I make a lot of homemade things, especially applesauces and blended soups, salad dressings, things like that I would prefer to store in my glass jars. Also, a frozen quart or pint jar doesn't actually equal a full quart or a full pint, especially when you consider that you have to leave the headspace. So this is not really a quart of broth, it's actually more like 3 cups. So that could throw off things if you're trying to get an exact measurement for a recipe. And the final reason why I don't like freezing broth in glass jars is because it takes the broth a really long time to thaw. So if I wanted to use this for dinner tonight, I wouldn't be able to because it wouldn't be thawed in time. But still, freezing broth in glass jars is an option, and if you can figure out a way to freeze it without it cracking, I would love for you to let me know. Okay, the next way to freeze bone broth is in zip-top bags. So you can use a gallon-sized bag, which is what this bag is, or you could use smaller bags like a quart size. You do want to make sure that you use bags that are specific for the freezer. The advantages of freezing broth in zip-top bags are that you can freeze them flat like this, and then once it's frozen, you can line the broth up. If you would picture like this is the shelf of a freezer, you could line the bags of bone broth up, and it's like you have a filing cabinet of broth, so your broth is easily accessible. Another advantage to freezing in bags is that even though this is frozen, I could open this bag up and actually rip it away from the brick of bone broth, and I could use it while it's frozen. Also, there's no worries with jars breaking. Next, you can freeze it in as small quantities or as large a quantity as you like. Again, you can use any type of freezer bag that fits your needs. The next advantage is that the amount that is measured is the amount that's in the bag, because it's unlike jars where you have to leave some headspace and it's not a full quart or a full pint. I know for sure because I measured 2 quarts or 8 cups of bone broth whenever I froze this bag of broth, so I know that there are exactly 8 cups or 2 quarts of bone broth here. And finally, you can reuse bags if you are freezing broth in them. You do need to make sure that there are no holes or rips in the bags, which sometimes happens whenever you freeze. But if you can manage to get the broth out without ripping the bags and with no holes, then the bags can be reused. The disadvantages to freezing bone broth in bags are that sometimes the bag does get a hole in it, and if that happens, whenever you're putting it in the freezer, then it can leak in your freezer, or if you don't get the seal completely closed before you freeze it. The next disadvantage is that it does create waste. Obviously the bag can't be reused all the time, but it may not even be able to be reused after the first use, so you might have to discard it, which would create waste. And the last disadvantage to freezing broth in bags are that the food is touching plastic. I don't love our food to touch plastic, but this is the freezing method that makes the most sense for us and that works for me. And I always make sure that the broth is at room temperature, that it is not hot whenever I put it into the bag. So those are the pros and cons of freezing bone broth in zip top bags. The final way that I have for you to freeze broth is using silicone molds or an ice cube tray to make pucks or cubes of broth. These are really cute, aren't they? The advantages to freezing in a mold like this are that these are reusable, so you're not creating more waste by the container that you're using to freeze. You can also measure out very small amounts of broth. For example, I know that each cube in this tray is 2 tablespoons. So if I just needed 2 tablespoons or 4 tablespoons of broth, then I know I could grab 2 cubes. The broth thaws really quickly whenever it's like this. It doesn't take any time at all for this amount of broth to thaw. So like here, I have about 1.5 cups of broth. So if I were going to drink some bone broth or use it to make a quick blended soup for just myself, or maybe use it to make a gravy or a sauce, then I would know that I have exactly 1.5 cups here and that it's going to thaw very quickly for me. In fact, I probably wouldn't even need to thaw it. I could just drop it right into the pot that I'm using to cook in. Finally, the storage container that you put the cubes in can be reused. So I know that there are no holes or leaks in this bag, and if I were to freeze more broth like this, I could keep refilling this bag time and time again, and I wouldn't have to throw it out. But the disadvantages to freezing bone broth in cubes or pucks like this are that it's not really an ideal size for families or when you need several cups of broth. And also the cubes and pucks still have to be stored in something. So I could store them in a glass jar if I wanted to keep my food from touching plastic or if I didn't have any bags. But again, that's tying up one of the glass jars. I could use this bag. Eventually, I'll probably have to throw this away. It will eventually get a hole in it. So it does create some waste, although it may not be in the immediate term. No matter which method you choose to freeze your bone broth, I hope that you are making and using a lot of it in your kitchen. It's such an easy and inexpensive way to increase the nutrient density of your foods and really give your family some great health benefits. If you want to check out the links below this video, I have instructions for how to do a 3-day bone broth fast. I also have recipes for Instant Pot pork bone broth and chicken foot broth. I have instructions on doing a 3-day bone broth fast, how you can do it, why to do it, and how to prepare for it. I'm answering the great question, the Instant Pot or the slow cooker, which is best for bone broth. And finally, if you've ever had trouble getting your bone broth to gel, I have my 6 tips for bone broth that gels every time. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll subscribe below and have a great day.